I will now turn it over to Professor Milani, who will introduce and moderate the Fireside Chat with General Frank McKenzie. Dr. Mohsen Milani is the Executive Director of the Center of Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and a Professor of Politics here at USF. He has held fellowships at Harvard, Oxford, Foscari University in Italy. Professor Milani has authored over 60 publications, including articles in leading academic and popular journals. His book, The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution, has been used as a required reading in universities across the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, and Iran. And he has hosted and spoken at numerous events on Afghanistan. So it's my great privilege to welcome my esteemed colleague, Professor Milani and General McKenzie to come. Professor?
It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce General McKenzie, the author of The Melting Point. Frankly, General McKenzie needs no introduction. If you don't know about him, you don't deserve to be in this place. He is an internationally renowned military leader and strategist. He's the Executive Director of USF's Global and National Security Institute, as well as the Executive Director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. Before joining our university, he served as Commander of the United States Command, retiring from his post in March 2022 after serving in the U.S. Marine Corps for more than 4 decades. He is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the National Security at the Middle East Institute, a member of the International Advisory Committee of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. Before I start asking him some question, I would like to thank Dr. Adi Farhadi, General McKenzie, GNSI, and Mr. Jim Cardoso for organizing this. For the record, this is my second conversation with General McKenzie. The first one took place about a month and a half ago. We focused on his book, specifically on what he has written about the Islamic Republic of Iran. So today I'm going to focus on Afghanistan. And I have to tell you, as somebody who has been teaching and writing about the Middle East for 30 years, I urge all of you to buy his book and to read his book. He is perhaps the only general that I know of that can write well, that is extremely articulate. He is a great writer and a great thinker, and it is my honor to have this second conversation with General McKenzie. General McKenzie, I'm going to start with the very easy question. The longest U.S. war in its history has been with Afghanistan. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, the U.S. has spent over $2.5 trillion in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Focusing on Afghanistan, after overthrowing the Taliban, and after 20 years of occupation, the U.S. withdrew and allowed the same force that it had gone to Afghanistan to begin with to take over power. What do you think went wrong? Was it a mistake of a strategy? And if so, why? Or was it a mistake of tactic?
Well, first of all, as always, great to chat with you, and thanks for the very easy opening softball question. I do appreciate that. Thanks for everybody for being here today. We're delighted on behalf of GNSI to have you here at USF. So, look, what happened in August of 2021 didn't begin in July of 2021 or June of 2021. It began back in the fall of 2001 when we entered Afghanistan. Now, I would argue that nations fight wars for 2 reasons. They fight them of necessity and they fight them of choice. The war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity. We had been attacked by terrorist groups operating from the platform of Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan to remove that threat. And that was the principal reason we went in. What happened over time, and actually at the beginning, was we changed the character of that war. We shifted our goals imperceptibly at first, and then incrementally, and then finally strategically to where we were going to build a state there. That was a mistake, and depending on your perspective, you can either look at it as American exceptionalism or American arrogance. But either way, when we went in the fall of '01, the goal was pretty simple: get Al-Qaeda out, and then we grew beyond that. Again, from a matter of incremental approaches at the very beginning. I would argue some of the things we did at the beginning, the form of government we established for Afghanistan was probably not ultimately suited for what ended up there. It failed to recognize the intensely tribal realities of life in Afghanistan. I would argue that Afghanistan is actually a governable country. It is not ungovernable. It is simply not governable in a Western model. And we attempted to continually impose a Western framework on it with some frills that the Afghans were not prepared to, willing to, or needed to digest. So these were mistakes at the very beginning. And there's a smart guy, all generals like to quote dead German strategists, so I'll quote Moltke. And he said that, mistakes at the beginning of a campaign cannot be rectified usually in the course of the entire campaign. And I would say many of our mistakes at the very beginning. And another thing at the very beginning, and I think the ambassador hit on it very well, we had an opportunity in winter 2001 into 2002 to do one of two things: either co-opt the Taliban and bring them into the government, or actually kill them all. We chose to do neither. And so as a result, the Taliban were able to regroup. And what really gave the Taliban the opportunity to regroup, I'll go back to a point I made at the beginning: nations fight wars for two reasons: necessity and choice. We chose to fight a war of choice against Iraq. And Iraq took our focus off Afghanistan in every way possible. I took a Marine Expeditionary Unit into Afghanistan in the summer of 2004, right as Iraq was heating back up. And the focus was not on Afghanistan in 2004, I can tell you, just from personal combat experience. So a lot of things at the very beginning where we had opportunities. We had an opportunity to actually get bin Laden in the Tora Bora Mountains in the fall of 2001. Think about it, had bin Laden been killed early in that campaign, it could have gone very, very differently. And that is not a political military mistake. That is a 100% military mistake made by one of my predecessors at U.S. Central Command. No, there's nobody not wearing a uniform that's responsible for that one. That's purely military. Had a chance there to sort of take a look at that. The other thing that I would say contributed to what happened in August of 2021, and again the ambassador touched on it, was, look, our counterinsurgency doctrine is very clear. You can't allow the force that you're fighting to have an offshore sanctuary. Well, they had an offshore sanctuary in Pakistan. And as Ambassador Khalilzad so rightly noted, we needed Pakistan in order to resupply ourselves. We needed Pakistan for a lot of reasons. And so Pakistan, caught in the middle of a very dangerous situation, played two ends against the middle. I went to see the Chief of Army Staff many times as the Central Command Commander, and we had these discussions, and he said, look, here's the reason we're playing a double game here, because you're going to leave. And of course, the Pakistanis were right. We left. So Pakistani strategic thought, while it may have contributed to our decision to leave, was ultimately something that they hold as the correct decision even today, I'm sure. So all of these things sort of build up and take us to what happens, in the spring, summer of 2021. Not things that happened very late in the campaign, but things that built up and actually shifted our thinking. Look, the Taliban have no intent to ever attack the United States. They don't even talk about it, except in some of their wilder moments. They don't talk about that at all. So it's not the Taliban, it's Al-Qaeda, and then later, after 2014-15, it's ISIS-Khorasan that's in Afghanistan. That's a national security threat to the United States. By the time I became the Central Command Commander in 2019, the logic for being in Afghanistan was you need a platform there in the Afghan military that will allow you to conduct counterterrorism operations against the remnants of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is on its back foot right now, and against ISIS. ISIS is not on its back foot right now. So that, from my logic, that's why we were in Afghanistan. But we grew well beyond that original conception of why we were there, and that's what led to actually happen at the end. That's why in the spring of 2021, when we decided to move out, we had one of the largest, maybe the largest embassy in the world in Kabul, Afghanistan. The Department of State doesn't like to leave because it's an admission to defeat. No ambassador likes to declare that. I, as a Marine, having worked in non-combatant evacuation operations for much of my career, very much aware of that. So that's why you tend to compress those decisions until the very end till you're in an extremis state. And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail later if you'd like. But writ large, we fought a war of necessity in Afghanistan that morphed into something we did not have to fight and should not have fought. And it changed its character over time. You never look back at the sunk costs. You always look forward. And so you've spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan. It takes you to a point where the reason that brought you in there is no longer adequate to keep you there. I'll just close my opening comments and a great question by saying, look, approximately we left Afghanistan because two American presidents, as unalike as any two U.S. presidents in American history, decided they want out of Afghanistan at a very high priority. I'm speaking, of course, of President Trump and President Biden. And that sort of closed the loop that began back in the fall of 2001 when we went into Afghanistan.
You made an excellent point about the U.S. desire to build a Western model of government in Afghanistan. I want to expand upon this. During his first term in office, President Trump, they asked Dr. Henry Kissinger, if you get a few minutes to talk to President Trump about the greatest challenge the U.S. faces, what would you tell him? And he said, I would tell him that China is the greatest challenge, and I would then tell him that you have good military advisors, right on, as people in Berkeley would say. You have good economic advisor, that's good. You have good political advisor, this is good. What you don't have, and that's one of the reasons why we're not doing well, you don't have any cultural advisor. We don't understand China. Now, based on what you just said about the model, Western model, you as a military general and the entire military operation, did they have any clue about Afghanistan's culture? I mean, being there for 2 decades and ending up shaking hands with your enemy, something is gone wrong beyond the military. It has to be something, I think, cultural, that we couldn't translate the messages the Afghan people were giving me. I speak Persian. I'm from Iran, and Afghanistan is a brother country. Many of them speak the same, we both speak the same language. I still don't understand Afghanistan as a culture. Do you think that played any role in the outcome of U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan?
A great question, and I take the case of China. Actually, culturally, it's important to understand China. I think it's less actually difficult to understand China in the context of which we're competing with China than it is to understand Afghanistan, because you're trying to remake Afghanistan. We're not trying to remake China. We're trying to impose a set of conditions on China, come to some sort of modality for going forward. That's a very different standard. But to go into Afghanistan, I'll give you an example. I'll cite myself as an example. In September of 2001, I was in the Pentagon the day it was struck. 3 years later, I was leading 5,000 people in southern Afghanistan. The totality of my military preparation in my life to that point had not been to fight in Afghanistan. It had been to fight the Russians, generally. And so we did not build a force that was capable of doing that. We have a very flexible force. We have a very capable force. But it is not necessarily a force that adapts itself quickly to conditions on the ground as you find in Afghanistan. Look, now we tried to do some things. General McChrystal, who I worked for a year in Kabul, stood up what we call the Afghan Hands Program, which was an attempt to acculturate people in Afghanistan, in Afghan culture, and allow them to redeploy into Afghanistan. The problem is the larger U.S. military doesn't tend to treat people well that do that in terms of the long-term progression of their careers. And when General McChrystal exited the stage, a lot of the emphasis for that was lost. So I take your point. I think it's a valid point. I don't think we ever accurately digested the culture there. But it goes to a larger issue, and I'll talk on it for just a minute since you bring it up. It's the fact that we are profoundly underprepared as Americans to engage the world with other languages. If I were king, I'd make every graduate of a U.S. military academy have 4 years of a foreign language. You can't get that right now, and I'm not going to be king. But I think that would be a step in the right direction. And I don't mean 4 years of an easy foreign language. I mean 4 years of a potential opponent's language. You're not going to learn to speak it in 4 years, but what you're going to be able to do is identify those people who can be trained later to speak it fluently. That's a genuine problem, and I do agree with you that we ultimately failed the test of knowing how to effectively operate within a very proud and warrior-like culture that is Afghanistan. They're great fighters in Afghanistan. Anyone who says they aren't hasn't had to fight them.
Hey, I know this is a conference about Afghanistan, but I want to go beyond Afghanistan. From what I understand, you're basically saying that it was a mistake on the part of the U.S. to try to establish a government, a style of governance based on a Western model. If this is the case, do you think we can say that the concept of regime change, as we understand it today, changing a regime and building a different kind of regime based on Western model, is a mistake, and that the U.S., based on its experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, should abandon this idea?
So I think we should be very humble about our ability to change the governing structure of another nation. We should be very humble about our ability to do that based on our track record and based on the larger track record of history. I would say instead, sometimes you need to accommodate some of the ways that nation operates. You don't have to, if you're going to be a global power, and the United States is a global power, you have to be willing to do business, lots of business, with people that not only share your values, but some that might only share your interests. And that's just the price of working on the global stage. It's the Wilsonian impulse in American foreign policy. We have to remake everything and what we think is best for them and best for us. And that certainly was a factor in what happened in Afghanistan, in my view.
I think this would be a very appropriate place in front of Ambassador Khalizad to ask you this critical question. And that is, do you think it was a mistake not to include the Afghan government in all details of negotiation with the Taliban?
So I think Ambassador Khalilzad tried very hard to include the Afghan government. And the Afghan government was a very difficult partner in those negotiations. And so I think it's easy to be critical and say, yes, I think he would say he would have preferred to have the Afghan government as a partner. We all would have, but we were just not able to get to that point. And the ambassador and our negotiating team was under great pressure. Remember, 2 presidents, both whom wanted out. And had we had more time, had we been able to put more sticks and carrots into the process, it is possible that we might have gotten to a different place. Yes, I would think we would have been better had that government been in there from the beginning. I'm sure the ambassador would say the same thing. Given the practical political realities of where we were and the time that we had and the attitude of the Taliban, that would have been a very high bar.
Based on your understanding, was it the U.S. policy to exclude the Afghan government so that they can conclude with the Taliban in a way that they thought if they would include the Afghan government, it would jeopardize the security aspect of this agreement?
I would not say it was. I don't believe it was a policy of the U.S. government to exclude the government of Afghanistan. I believe it was an outcome of a desire to exit at a very high priority. I would put it to you like that. I don't believe it was a policy objective to exclude the government of Afghanistan. Again, they were very difficult partners. I certainly work with them. I'm aware of that. But I think the driving engine from the very top of 2 U.S. presidential administrations was to depart and to depart quickly. And so that's what drives everything that happens underneath it.
In your book, you get into detail, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's one of the best part of the book about the U.S. decision to get out and why it ended up in a fiasco. Would you tell us, in retrospect, what went wrong? And I think in your book you provide a vivid, I think persuasive argument why it went wrong. Would you share that with us?
Sure. So I'll just recap briefly. On Inauguration Day in January 2021, as President Trump left the stage, there were 2,500 U.S. soldiers, more or less, in Afghanistan. And there were 4,000 to 5,000 NATO soldiers left in Afghanistan. And the agreement, President Trump signed a memorandum saying, I'm going to leave office with 2,500. punt it over to President Biden to make whatever decision he wanted to make going forward. So that's what we had when President Biden came into office. I was a Central Command commander. My subordinate, General Scott Miller, an Army 4-star, was our guy on the ground. And so President Biden's going to make the decision from that point. We had originally committed, under the original terms of the Doha Agreement, to leave by May of 2021. In January of 2021, it begins to be obvious that you're not going to be able to get out by May. So the president went into a decision-making process. I participated in that decision-making process, as did the ambassador. I met with the president virtually twice in February of 2021, where we made the case, and my case was we should stay at a level of about 2,500 U.S. soldiers. We believed, General Miller and I, that at that level we could continue to support the Afghan military in the field. We would still be able to have support inside the various ministries of government. We would be able to ensure that they were supplied properly, that their airplanes would fly, and their airplanes were an asymmetric advantage that the Afghans had against the Taliban, and we would be able to provide continued support, fire support for them as well. In mid-April, President Biden made the decision that we're going to go to zero. I was actually on an airplane here in Tampa getting ready to take off when the Secretary of Defense called me. We held the airplane on the ramp so I could talk to him on the secure call. And he said, look, we're going to go to zero, and we're going to get out originally by 11 September. And then the president recast that date as 31 August. So we had our marching orders in mid-April, and we had a plan to get out. And here's where I think, in my judgment, the fatal flaw of the Biden decision exists. First of all, it's his decision to make. He's the President of the United States. We're going to loyally execute any order that he gets. That's just the way the system works. It can't work any other way. And I never thought about resigning or doing anything else because my advice wasn't taken. My advice sometimes is taken, sometimes it's not. What's important is civilians make decisions. He made a decision. But the flaw is this. We had probably in April, we probably had 3,000 or more in our embassy. We had many tens of thousands of U.S. citizens, and we had hundreds of thousands of at-risk Afghans. We made the decision in April to withdraw our military, 2,500 troops, and the massive amounts of equipment that we had. All that came out. We got it out. It was a seamless, very smoothly run operation. By the 12th of July, when General Miller left the country and I relieved him in a ceremony in Kabul, we were down to 700 U.S. soldiers that protected the U.S. Embassy and Karzai International, the airport in Kabul. So all of our equipment was gone. What we had not done, though, was draw down our embassy, brought out our citizens, or brought out our Afghans. What we should have done and what we recommended was when you begin the drawdown in April, you need to begin to bring out these other groups of people. Now, if you do that, there's a risk. And here's the risk. Here's the counterfactual. You could cause a more rapid collapse of the government of Afghanistan because you're bringing out key people that as President Ghani told me face-to-face a couple of times, don't take these people out, we need them to fight. So that we don't know what the result of that would have been. But it would have left us in a very different situation than we arrived at in August. So as we begin to draw down, and by June, July, we are no longer supporting the Afghans. Let me give you an example of what that means. If I'm sending a case of mortar rounds into Afghanistan in July of 2021, say 24 rounds in a box of ammo, it's going to go down to a mortar platoon. Before, it would have been offloaded at the ramp at, say, Karzai International. There would have been a U.S. contractor there that would help the Afghans check it. It would have gone into a computer system, gone down, eventually to the firing platoon. And there would have been people to help the Afghans manage a complex logistics system. Not people in combat, but people helping them. In July of 2021, that case is dropped off with a boom. It falls on the ramp at H-Kaya. The airplane taxis away. No one in the world knows what happens to that mortar ammunition. I suspect half of it went to the Taliban, a third of it went to a bazaar somewhere to be sold, and maybe a couple of rounds got down to a firing platoon inside the Afghan military. That's an example of what changed when we left. It's easy, everybody talks about the fighting forces, and they're important, but it's also what lets a large military organization feed itself, train itself, equip itself, and provide ammunition for the soldiers that are actually out there supposed to do in the fighting. All of that was gone. Our support for their airplanes was gone. We talked about doing it by iPad. So actually, United Airlines has tried to do long-range maintenance by virtually. It doesn't work in the United States with a highly technically literate society. It certainly won't work in Afghanistan. So what you've got is support falls away. Provincial capitals begin to fall. And I had said, beginning back in 2020, if we pull out completely, they're going to collapse. This was my view. This was the view of my commander on the ground, General Miller. This was a view of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We wrote a lot of memos on that I'm sure organizations are going to uncover as they do their research here. And I welcome that opportunity because nothing concentrates the bureaucratic mind than a signed letter from a four-star general warning of disaster. So all that correspondence is out there. We get to high summer 2021, we're gone, we're out. Still got a lot of people there. The non-combatant evacuation operation, the decision to evacuate the embassy was made on the 14th of August. Think about it. That's why what you saw happen in August happened in August. We waited to the very, very end. We had moved the embassy over to the airfield to try to protect them a little bit better, but we hadn't made a decision to get them out. We needed to bring out tens and tens of thousands of U.S. citizens. That had not started. We needed to bring out hundreds of thousands of Afghans. That had not started. The Special Immigrant Visa Program brought them out at a trickle, at a glacial rate that would have taken to 2030 to complete the movement probably. So we were in a very bad situation. I go back to the original decision in April, which was President Biden's decision to come out, but not to do the other things to bring our forces, people out. That's what directly led to what happened in August, where now you've got a system that's stressed to the max. We got 124,000 people out. I'd be the first to tell you, if you held a Venn diagram up, here's the 124,000 we got out, here's the 124,000 we wanted to get out. They don't overlap. They overlap to a degree, but they don't completely overlap. You like one-to-one concurrence. You don't have one-to-one concurrence on that. So those decisions, what led to what happened in August, very directly. It is an interagency problem. The State Department does not like to make a decision to leave. You want to try to find a reason to hang on, because leaving is an admission of failure. No diplomat likes to do that. The tough situation in August, that's how we got there.
General McKenzie, in 2004, I attended a conference in Washington, and I know at least two of the people here were in that conference. A very prominent analyst in Washington said that Talibanism doesn't exist. He said Talibanism was M. He said it's finished. It's gone. It's never going to come back. And today, Talibanism is back. From your perspective as a distinguished military strategist, what do you think the Taliban did right to win?
So I don't know when you attended the conference in 2004, but I can tell you in July of 2004, I was down in Uruzgan province fighting the Taliban, and there were hundreds of them, and they fought pretty well. So I don't know what the analysts saw. I can only tell you what then Colonel McKenzie saw in very heavy combat down in Uruzgan, Tarin Kowt, Casa Uruzgan, that miserable high country down there in northern Uruzgan province. So the Taliban never went away. Again, I come back to a point right after we entered the country, we missed a profound strategic opportunity to either co-opt them or operate against them very heavily and eradicate them. After that, they had roots in Pakistan, they had roots in the Afghan people, began a reaction, to the government of Afghanistan that the ambassador talked about. So it became increasingly harder to do that over time. I would argue by 2004, 5, 6, it was a much more difficult problem than it would have been in 2002 to actually, and now they think they have a path to the future because our focus is off Afghanistan. Again, the war in Iraq, you have to, anytime you look at what happened in Afghanistan, you have to look at the war in Iraq and the way it took our focus off what was going on in Again, a war of necessity and a war of choice.
Now, my final question is to you. Do you think the U.S. should recognize the Taliban and go back and reestablish the embassy in Kabul?
So that's actually not a question for a general. That's a question for a diplomat. But I will tell you, my answer would be no, I do not. If my opinion were asked, I would say we have to see some things first. We have to see action against Al Qaeda. We have to see action against ISIS. We have to see some of those things first. That would be my area of interest. Others might propose human rights actions by the Taliban. My focus is on attacks against the United States being developed from the ungovernable spaces in Afghanistan. And look, I would only quote my successor, General Kurilla, and what he said in testimony, which is that ISIS-K is regrouping, they are gaining power, and they do plan to attack us in the United States. And they carried out a very successful attack in Russia just a few months ago, just south of Moscow. So ISIS-K is very much there. I would want to see something very specific before I would be willing to do anything at all with the Taliban going forward. But here's the thing, and again, if you're going to be a global power, you have to be able to sit down and eat with the devil. You have to be able to deal with every nation, everywhere you are. So you should never turn your back on it, but you should just make sure that we get what we want out of the deal before we agree to do that.
General McKenzie, you have said this 3 or 4 times in our previous conversation and in this conversation, that Iraq took so much away from the focus on Afghanistan. Are you saying that we cannot fight 2 wars at the same time?
The United States can fight a number of wars at the same time if you're willing to pay the price to do it. But just like President Johnson in Vietnam, you can't even fight one war if you're not willing to, effectively, if you're not willing to mobilize the country behind you. The United States likes to fight its wars on the cheap with a purely volunteer recruited force. And when you do that, it limits your ability to fight multiple wars. I don't think it was a lack of equipment or resources. I think it was a lack of focus.
I have a number of questions. There are 4 of them, and we got only 5 more minutes, so I'll ask them quickly. Why did the Doha Agreement not include a ceasefire with the Afghan government that would have allowed a smoother withdrawal?
Well, I think we've already sort of talked about that. I mean, the original plan had a number of conditions that were in it. We generally met our conditions. The Taliban generally did not meet all of their conditions, although a very important point, they stopped attacking coalition forces, and that was a very smart move on their part, and they were able to do that. But beyond that, we never got to a position, we never forced the Taliban never had to, and the actual Afghan government wasn't particularly willing to get to a point where you could have that kind of a truce.
The next question is, you alluded to the impact of a lack of strategic coherence in Afghanistan over time. What should the U.S. strategic goal have been? That's a tough one.
So I would argue in the fall of 2001, you went in to ensure that Al Qaeda was destroyed. You should have destroyed Al Qaeda, and then I would have, and looking back now with the virtue of hindsight, a more minimalist approach would have been helpful. We had the world's backing for going into Afghanistan. We had NATO. Article 5 was declared as a result of this. But the temptation to impose a larger vision is just too lucrative, too seductive to walk away from. We should have rejected that. We should have kept to a more minimalist approach to it. We had the capabilities and the resources to do what we wanted to do in Afghanistan without rebuilding a new country there.
And the last and final question, this is more for me than perhaps the people who are interested in Afghanistan. When you look at the Middle East today, the Israeli government is talking about the new order in the Middle East. There is a possibility of military confrontation between Israel and Iran, and in which case the U.S. is definitely going to be dragged into that war. Is there any lesson that we should have learned from Afghanistan that can be applied to the case of the Middle East today so that we can prevent another catastrophe in that region?
I should think, yes, we're the most powerful nation in the world. We should have a very humble view of our ability to actually influence things that go on in the Middle East. It's an ancient culture that thinks in terms of thousands of years. We think in terms of weeks. We're profoundly, perhaps uniquely unsuited to be a major player in the Middle East. You know, as we talked about Iran, for example, when most people think of Iran, most Americans think our history with Iran began in 1978 when they seized our embassy. more astute Americans recognize perhaps it was 1953 when we overthrew an elected prime minister and put the Shah back in on the peacock throne. But actually, the Iranian history goes back thousands of years. And they are erudite and literate in that history. We don't know anything at all about that history. And so we operate at a disadvantage when we go in there.
General McKenzie, finally, I have to say that the more I talk with you, the more I realize that you're a wise man. So thank you very much for this fantastic conversation.